Cue the sad music. It's that time. We got summary post. I hope you guys enjoyed this series as much as I enjoyed making it and producing it. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. You got to see my colic in all sorts of different environments. It's got a mind of its own, needs its own Instagram. I'm going to have voting tomorrow about the next series. Last time it was between hamstring and low back won, but I'm still going to add a couple other options. Next series will start November 2nd. I got some fun stuff I want to do in the meantime. So I'm going to go through each one very briefly, and you can refer back to the post to get more info. So the first one was engaging the true core. What is the true core? Well, first, what is it not? It's not the rectus abdominis, the showboat six-pack muscles. Those look great, but for the health and protection of our spine, that's not it. It's the internal obliques, external obliques, and transversus abdominis. In this post, I go over how to properly fire your core. Next up is the range of motion. The number one cause of low back pain from a range of motion standpoint or tightness is loss of hip extension by tightness in your hip flexors. Why is that? If you don't have the ability to extend your thigh, you're going to make up for it in your low back. You're going to get that excessive curve, that lumbar lordosis, which can lead to excessive loading on your low back. How do you know if you are restricted with your hip extension? Take a broomstick, measure out the distance between the ground and just below your kneecap. Put that distance away from the wall. Can you keep that dowel or that stick parallel with your spine and vertical and tap your heel to the wall? If you can, pass, great, move on. If you fail, either this, where you're bending forward, is the only way you can reach the wall, where if you look, I'm not actually having any hip extension, or if the dowel or the stick comes off of one of the three contact points. If you fail, how do we correct for it? The sequence in order to improve your hip extension and to pass the previous test, we have two methods. First, push, which is a combination of pushing and smushing. I'm southern now. That's where we go after that trigger point or that knot. And then second is pulling, and that's your more traditional stretching. The analogy that I like to use is the muscle fiber is like a rope. If I've got a knot within that rope, I can't just stretch that knot out. I need to release the knot first, push it, and then I can stretch it. So that's the combination. And then the three muscles that can cause a limitation in your hip extension are your psoas, your iliacus, which do separate out in the beginning of their origins, as you'll see 1 and 2. They have the same insertion to form your iliopsoas, but when you're doing the release, see the previous post, you need to be able to differentiate the two. And then also the rectus femoris, which is the only one of the four quads that does cross your hip joint and can limit hip extension. Stability. So we went over two main causes of stability. One was at the glute, at the hip, and the other one was at the core. For correctives, or the first one, we said it's either weakness of your core, just that you don't have the ability to support your body, or are you locking out your lumbar spine? They go hand in hand sometimes. When we lock out the joint, it's so we don't have to use the core, and we rely on the congruency of the joint, the facet joints of the spine, which is not ideal. So to correct for that, both the locking of the lumbar spine and working your core, you've got to have neutral spine or know what neutral spine is. This is a representation. This represents all the way bending forward. This represents all the way bending backwards of your lumbar spine. We're trying to find that middle point, that happy medium, where the facet joints aren't engaged, the spine is the least loaded. So how you find that is you take your pelvis through anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, shave a little bit off, you find that middle ground. Then, as we learned previously how to fire your core, we now fire in this neutral position. Now holding that neutral position, if you can't do a plank, we're working on going more and more horizontal, and then we work on going more vertical, static, not moving, to dynamic, running man, how we use our core in real life. My favorite, the hangry glute. That glute me, that queen herself. There she is, all done up, all dolled up. We went over the analogy of all analogies. I might have lost some of you on that one, but this was an example of silent culprit, noisy victim. Silent culprit, the glute, weakness of the glute. Noisy victim is leaning over to reduce the demand of the hip, causing the low back pain. The low back pain is the noisy victim. So how do we work your hip abductors properly? How do we work the glute med? How we use in running? Feed the queen. It's not clamshells. We have to work the muscle how we use it with running to stabilize our pelvis. So clamshell should be used as a warm-up or maybe a regression, but we've got to mirror how we use that muscle with running. The way that I found that this works the best is through the hip burner exercise. And then my favorite part, running form faults. We talked about the not so fantastic form faults that cause low back pain. We've got your stomper hitting the ground excessively too hard. We've got your sloucher and your locker, which are opposite. We're going forward, we're going back. And then we have the collapser, where we're dropping down or we have some break in the chain. For those were either some cues is imagine that the ground is on fire. As soon as you land, you're trying to get your weight off of that. Another cue was if you imagine like you're running with headphones on or actually put headphones in without the music, the louder you hear that force go up the chain, the harder you're landing. Make sure when you land, it's on off, and we're trying to land as soft, as quiet as possible. For the sloucher, make sure we're leaning forward at the ankles, not at the hips. Drive your belly button up and in deeper towards your spine and your tailbone down to keep that neutral spine to prevent the locking out. And the cue for the collapser is keep that rectangle symmetrical. Make sure we're not collapsing down, not making a rhomboid or whatever kind of shape, keeping it symmetrical. So these are the thoughts. The drills that go along with these. Stomper, work on landing soft and quiet doing jumps. For the sloucher, it was using a broomstick, contact point in the back of your head between your shoulder blades and on your sacrum, leaning forward at the ankles, practicing landing, keeping that symmetrical to avoid this hinging at your hips and to avoid slouching. Then the lumbar locker, finding that neutral spine, using the band to lean, have the core engaged, and make sure you're leading with the core and not locking out your lumbar spine. And then finally for the collapser, a series of exercises including that hip burner exercise, farmer's walks for both static and dynamic stability, where we're trying to keep that rectangle symmetrical, firing up the glutes and avoiding that collapsing. And then finally, it doesn't matter what you're doing when you're running, if you are sitting for 10 hours a day with improper posture and you're having low back pain, it might not be the running, it might be how you're sitting. So the three things to think about to make it easy to remember: hips higher, hips higher, hips higher than your knees. And that prevents you from slumping down. We're trying to keep that pelvis, that neutral spine level. When your knees are higher than your hips, that bowl of water is spilling out of the back and we can't have that appropriate neutral spine as easily. Using a pool noodle for lumbar support. The only point of contact with the back of that chair is through that noodle. How you find it is you slide it down, see where it stops, sit up tall. How does it feel? Your body will intuitively tell you too high, too low. When you adjust it, even when you get in the perfect spot, don't just push and lean back into it. It's not meant for that. It's meant to give you some support and cue you to have the proper posture. But also notice my upper back is not against the back of the chair. If I have my upper back against a chair, one, that's not going to feel great pushing into my lower back, and two, I'm going to have to bring my neck forward to the task at hand. My favorite that applies to every situation is be the king, be the queen that you are. Adapt the tasks or objects to you. Don't adapt you to the task. The moment that we do this, we're stressing something. They showed the head weighs about 12 to 15 pounds. At 60 degrees of flexion, can be up to 60 pounds of stress at the base of your neck on the joint. And hopefully that was helpful to you guys to work on that workplace setup. Also, stay tuned to my story tomorrow. There's going to be a 24-hour poll where I'm going to go over ideas for the next topic, where you guys vote and I'm going to do it. Obviously, the hamstring is going to be on there. I'm throwing around the idea of lateral ankle pain, lateral hip pain, groin pain. You let me know if you have any ideas for future topics too, besides just the poll. Drop them below. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.